The Pacific Ocean, a theater of unimaginable scale, concealed a secret war fought beneath the waves. In the early days of America's entry into World War II, the United States Navy placed immense faith in its growing fleet of submarines. These vessels were tasked with a vital, perilous mission, strangling the Imperial Japanese war machine by severing its supply lines. The initial performance of the American submarines, however, was tragically hampered by a series of technical deficiencies. Most notably, the Mark VI torpedo detonator and its associated magnetic influence feature proved to be notoriously unreliable and frustratingly unpredictable. But a less dramatic, yet equally critical, failing lay in the seemingly simple anti-submarine weapon, the ubiquitous depth charge. U.S. destroyers and destroyer escorts relied heavily on these cylindrical steel drums filled with high explosives to hunt and eliminate enemy U-boats. The explosive device was designed to be rolled off the stern or fired from side-mounted K-guns, creating a devastating hydrostatic shockwave upon detonation. However, the standard procedure and calibration for these depth charges severely limited their initial effectiveness against the determined and deep-diving Japanese submarines. Allied intelligence, still in its nascent stages regarding the enemy's capabilities, had consistently underestimated the true operational depth of the Japanese fleet. The resulting depth charge attacks, therefore, were often mere inconveniences to the Japanese crews lurking far below the explosive's effective range. These early failures led to an atmosphere of cautious optimism and even outright derision within the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Navy. American submariners, meanwhile, experienced profound frustration as they watched their prey escape time and again. The war's opening chapter was defined by a critical imbalance. A lethal weapon existed, but its delivery system was systematically flawed. This overlooked technical detail allowed the Japanese to consolidate their early naval gains with a dangerous, false sense of underwater security. The stage was set for a dramatic and inevitable shift in naval fortunes, but only once the Americans recognized and rectified this fundamental mistake. The early months were a period of painful, often deadly, learning for the U.S. anti-submarine forces. Reports quickly filtered back to the highest echelons of the Imperial Japanese Navy concerning the ineffectual nature of American anti-submarine warfare. Japanese admirals, veterans of a long-standing and rigorous naval tradition, began to openly mock the American depth charge capabilities. Naval intelligence summaries circulated amongst the officer corps detailed numerous encounters where U.S. surface vessels had unleashed barrages of explosives to no effect. The typical U.S. depth charge setting was often limited to a shallow 100 or 150 feet, a depth easily surpassed by the robustly constructed Japanese submarine fleet. The I-class submarines, massive vessels designed for long-range patrols and deep submersion, could comfortably dive to depths exceeding 300 feet. A U.S. attack would commence. The jarring thud of explosions would rattle the Japanese hulls, but the detonations were simply too far away to inflict fatal damage. Submarine commanders reported the attacks with an almost dismissive tone, describing the explosions as harmless fireworks in the distance. This generated a dangerous complacency among the Japanese, who incorrectly assumed the Americans were either technically incapable or tactically ignorant. Japanese crews developed countertactics based on this flawed assessment, relying on deep diving as an almost guaranteed method of evasion. The mockery was born from a confluence of factors: superior Japanese naval design, overconfidence in their own skills, and the demonstrable failures of American ordnance. This period of derision served to embolden Japanese submarine operations, leading them to take greater risks in their patrols and attack runs. They believed they held the strategic advantage beneath the surface, protected by the enemy's own flawed weapon settings. The American surface ships, on the other hand, grew increasingly demoralized by the constant inability to score a definitive kill. Crews aboard destroyers and escorts grew accustomed to the sight of oil slicks and debris that never materialized into a sunk enemy vessel. The failure was not in the courage or competence of the American sailors, but in a simple, overlooked mechanical calibration that rendered their primary weapon useless. The psychological warfare was being won by the Japanese, whose quiet amusement translated into a tactical edge in the early to mid stages of the war. Their mockery, however, was a historical echo that would soon turn into a horrified scream as the war's technological realities shifted against them. The initial American depth charge, primarily the Mark VII, was a reliable design in theory but was handicapped by inadequate tactical doctrine and flawed technical assumptions. The charge was designed to create a devastating pressure wave, but this required detonation within close proximity to the submarine's hull. Crucially, the default firing mechanism settings were established based on pre-war intelligence and testing that grossly underestimated the capabilities of modern enemy submarines. American naval planners initially believed that submarines could not safely operate at depths greater than 150 feet for sustained periods. This dangerously outdated intelligence informed the primary depth settings used by anti-submarine warfare ships patrolling the Pacific Theater. As a result, when a Japanese submarine was detected, the surface ships would drop charges set to detonate at a shallow depth, expecting the shockwave to be decisive. The Japanese, having built their formidable fleet with superior steel alloys and welding techniques, were able to routinely dive to depths of 300 to 400 feet, effortlessly evading the explosions. The failure was not confined solely to the depth setting. The actual testing and implementation of the depth charge also revealed a systemic lack of realism. Simulations and training exercises often failed to account for the real-world deep diving performance of the enemy's vessels. There was a profound institutional lag in adapting to the realities of a modern, fast-moving, and technologically advanced naval war. The manufacturing process itself, under the pressure of wartime production, did little to address the fundamental calibration issues. American sailors were using a weapon built for a war that no longer existed, a war against less capable submarines of a previous generation. The irony of the situation was that the depth charge itself contained sufficient explosive power to crush any submarine if it could be detonated correctly. The problem was a matter of timing and trigonometry. The charge simply needed to be set for the true depth of the submerged vessel. This technical inadequacy resulted in countless lost opportunities to cripple the Japanese supply lines and allowed enemy crews to become complacent. The U.S. Navy was slowly forced to confront the embarrassing truth that one of its most essential anti-submarine tools was operating at a fraction of its intended lethality. Correcting this fundamental flaw became an urgent, top-secret priority for the technical experts in the Naval Ordnance Laboratory. The Imperial Japanese Navy approached submarine warfare with a different philosophical and tactical doctrine than their German or American counterparts. Their submarines were not merely coastal defense vessels but massive, long-range cruisers, designed for scouting, transporting aircraft, and fleet operations. The formidable I-class submarines, such as the I-400 class, were among the largest and most advanced in the world at the time of their construction. Their robust, double-hulled construction and high-quality steel allowed them to descend far deeper than many U.S. naval planners had estimated. This superior structural integrity meant they could withstand immense hydrostatic pressure, which was a critical defense against early Allied attacks. Japanese commanders were trained to utilize this deep-diving capability as their ultimate and most reliable defensive measure when facing anti-submarine patrols. When sonar contact was made, the standard operating procedure was to immediately plunge to maximum depth, a range where they knew Allied ordnance could not reach. This deep dive became a guaranteed escape tactic, contributing directly to the Japanese admirals' overconfidence and disdain for U.S. efforts. Their offensive doctrine focused on commerce raiding and high-value naval targets, rather than the wolf-pack tactics popularized by the German U-boats. However, the Japanese also viewed their submarines as integral parts of the main battle fleet, employing them for reconnaissance and to screen larger surface combatants. This dual role meant the subs were frequently operating near-surface engagements, increasing their exposure but also relying heavily on their deep-diving safety cushion. The Japanese intelligence community also carefully monitored the effectiveness of enemy weapons, quickly identifying the shallow settings of the U.S. depth charges. This knowledge was disseminated throughout the fleet, reinforcing the deep dive strategy and solidifying the perception of American inadequacy. The confidence was not misplaced initially. Their technology did afford them a substantial advantage against the current U.S. countermeasures. This tactical superiority below the waves made their supply convoys feel safer, allowing vital resources like oil, iron, and rubber to flow more freely to the Japanese mainland. Their doctrine was a calculated risk that paid dividends until the fundamental technical flaw in the American arsenal was finally addressed. The depth of their operational capability was the literal measure of the challenge facing the U.S. Navy's technical experts. The turning point in the silent war against Japanese submarines was not a ground fleet action but a quiet, diligent effort within U.S. intelligence and ordnance labs. The first critical step was the painful acknowledgement by the U.S. Navy of the consistent and embarrassing failure rate of their anti-submarine attacks. Naval analysts began meticulously comparing sinking reports with actual patrol data, cross-referencing sonar contacts with the lack of confirmed kills. The discrepancy between the number of times a submarine was tracked and the number of times one was destroyed became too vast to ignore. A pivotal moment came with the recovery of either damaged Japanese equipment, captured documents, or the interrogation of prisoners of war. This intelligence haul provided the hard, undeniable evidence that confirmed the true operational diving depths of the Japanese fleet. The recovered data unequivocally showed that Japanese I-boats could regularly descend to depths of 350 to 400 feet, well beyond the standard U.S. setting. This information confirmed the long-held suspicions of many seasoned American anti-submarine warfare specialists who had been frustrated by their orders. The realization was a stark and immediate indictment of the outdated intelligence models that had governed U.S. naval tactics since the war's beginning. The intelligence breakthrough was immediately classified as highly sensitive, understanding its potential to revolutionize the Pacific Naval War. The information bypassed standard bureaucratic channels and went straight to the technical teams responsible for depth charge calibration and deployment doctrine. It became abundantly clear that the problem was not the charge explosive power, but the simple, adjustable mechanism that dictated its detonation point. The solution was deceptively simple: change the default settings on the depth charges to match the known maximum diving depth of the enemy. This quiet, technical adjustment had the power to transform the balance of power overnight, turning a harmless explosion into a crippling hydrostatic blow. The intelligence officers who secured this data had effectively handed the U.S. Navy the key to solving their most persistent tactical problem. The war's entire underwater dynamic hinged on this shift from assumption-based warfare to intelligence-driven precision. Following the critical intelligence findings, the U.S. Navy immediately initiated a massive, covert program to recalibrate and retrain its entire anti-submarine force. The primary change involved modifying the depth-setting mechanisms on the existing stock of Mark 7 and Mark 9 depth charges. New, deeper settings, often exceeding 300 and 400 feet, were introduced as the standard deployment depths for all anti-submarine patrols in the Pacific. This was not a complex engineering challenge, but a wholesale change in doctrine and a simple, yet profound, adjustment to a mechanical clockwork fuse. The Naval Ordnance Laboratory worked tirelessly to produce new calibration plates and clear instructional manuals for the surface fleet. The modification was often carried out in secret at forward operating bases, with ordnance crews working around the clock to implement the crucial change. Training manuals and tactical doctrine were rapidly rewritten and disseminated to destroyer captains and sonar operators across the vast Pacific theater. The emphasis shifted from dropping a pattern of shallow explosions to placing a smaller, more lethal pattern at the exact expected depth of the deep-diving enemy. A key part of the rethink also involved improving the coordination between sonar operators and the bridge, ensuring precise tracking of the submerged target. The new settings meant that the resulting underwater shockwave would detonate much closer to the Japanese hull, delivering the intended, devastating blow. The hydrostatic pressure generated by an underwater explosion is amplified tremendously by proximity, and the deeper settings ensured this lethal closeness. This strategic change marked a shift from a generalized, hoping for the best attack to a focused, intelligence-driven, and highly destructive strike. The simplicity of the solution belied its tremendous impact on the war's outcome, transforming the depth charge from a psychological deterrent into a literal submarine crusher. This effort required total secrecy, as prematurely revealing the new capability would allow the Japanese to adjust their maximum safe operating depths. The American anti-submarine force was now armed with the correct knowledge and the appropriately calibrated tools to finally combat the enemy effectively. The shift in depth charge settings was immediately accompanied by a dramatic overhaul of the American anti-submarine warfare (ASW) tactics. The focus moved away from simply chasing the sonar contact to meticulously tracking the enemy and predicting its evasive maneuvers. U.S. destroyer captains were now trained to utilize a creeping attack method, which involved a slower, quieter, and more precise approach over the target. This new technique allowed the surface vessel to maintain better sonar contact right up to the moment of deploying the depth charges. Crucially, the new doctrine stressed the use of a coordinated hedgehog attack pattern, where multiple charges were dropped simultaneously in a precise, three-dimensional grid. This pattern, often fired from a new weapon called the hedgehog mortar, increased the probability of a direct hit or a devastating near-miss at the optimal depth. The depth charge racks and K-guns were now loaded with charges set to multiple, deep detonation points, creating a lethal underwater basket for the submerged submarine. The improved American radar and sonar technology also played a vital supporting role, allowing for earlier detection and more accurate initial targeting. Training exercises were made more rigorous and realistic, forcing crews to practice complex, multi-ship attack coordinated maneuvers against simulated deep-diving targets. The morale of the surface fleet surged as the first reports of confirmed kills using the new settings began to filter back to the training bases. Sailors and officers who had grown weary of their weapons' impotence suddenly found themselves wielding a formidable, decisive tool of war. The new tactics required greater skill and coordination, but the reward was the certain elimination of a major naval threat. This new chapter in the Battle of the Atlantic and Pacific turned the hunters into the hunted, fundamentally altering the Japanese commander's decision matrix. The deep, safe sanctuary they once relied upon was now a potential death trap, subject to the crushing force of a well-aimed and deeply set explosion. The combination of corrected ordnance and advanced tactics created an entirely new and overwhelmingly dominant anti-submarine force. The transition from a mocking derision to a crushing reality for the Imperial Japanese Navy was swift and absolutely brutal. The first successful attacks using the new, deeper setting sent shockwaves of disbelief and panic through the Japanese submarine command structure. Submarine commanders who had previously scoffed at the distant, shallow explosions now found themselves at the epicenter of devastating blasts. The hydrostatic shockwave from a depth charge detonating at 350 feet was a cataclysmic event for a submerged hull. Bulkheads buckled, welds shattered, internal systems failed, and the very air within the submarine became a thick fog of fear and confusion. The sheer pressure from a close, deep explosion was enough to cause structural implosion, instantly sending the vessel to the bottom of the Pacific. Reports of entire submarine patrols vanishing without a trace began to accumulate in the Japanese naval headquarters. The reliable escape tactic of diving deep was now rendered useless, leaving commanders with no effective countermeasure to the newfound American precision. The psychological impact on the Japanese crews was immense, as their perceived invulnerability was violently stripped away. The silence of the deep ocean, once a source of comfort, became a terrifying, confined chamber waiting for the inevitable, lethal blow. The attacks were no longer mere inconveniences but decisive, deadly executions that left no survivors and no possibility of rescue. American anti-submarine forces were now scoring confirmed kills with a regularity that had been unthinkable just months prior. The shift in sinking rates was a clear, undeniable graph of success, marking the moment the U.S. Navy truly mastered the art of underwater combat. This crushing reality spelled the beginning of the end for the Japanese submarine fleet's ability to operate freely and effectively. The mocking laughter of the Admirals had been replaced by the sound of distress calls and the final, fatal groan of a sinking hull. The dramatic increase in Japanese submarine losses forced the Imperial Navy to convene urgent and highly secretive meetings to address the sudden, catastrophic shift in the war. High-ranking admirals, initially skeptical of the American capability, were confronted with undeniable evidence of their fleet's rapid decimation. The reports of American depth charges hitting with lethal accuracy at extreme depths were met with a mixture of disbelief and profound alarm. Naval engineers and intelligence analysts struggled to comprehend how the Americans had so quickly and effectively overcome their previously glaring technical deficiency. The Japanese quickly surmised that the U.S. Navy had somehow acquired accurate information on their deep diving capabilities and adjusted their ordnance accordingly. The strategic conversation immediately shifted from dismissive confidence to desperate damage control and the development of new, frantic counter-tactics. Submarine deployments were rapidly curtailed, and patrol routes were shifted further away from heavily protected Allied convoys and naval bases. Commanders were issued new, yet often ineffective, instructions to utilize extreme silence, slow speed, and deceptive maneuvers to evade the now lethal American hunters. New hull strengthening programs were discussed, but such major retrofitting was often impossible to implement during the height of the war. The psychological fallout was also a major concern, as the once proud submarine crews became acutely aware of their newfound vulnerability. The Admirals realized that the loss of their deep-diving sanctuary was a strategic disaster, compromising their entire underwater doctrine. This sudden realization exposed a critical flaw in their intelligence. They had focused too much on their own superiority and not enough on the enemy's capacity for rapid technical adaptation. The mocking tone vanished completely, replaced by a grim determination to survive in a much more hostile, three-dimensional battlefield. The Japanese Navy was forced into a purely defensive posture, their offensive submarine power effectively neutralized by a simple change in depth charge settings. The profound military consequences of this single adjustment were felt across the entire Pacific theater of operations. The pervasive feeling within the Japanese submarine fleet following the depth charge correction was a catastrophic loss of confidence. Submarine service, once a posting of high honor and perceived safety, rapidly became one of the most perilous assignments in the Imperial Navy. The deep, silent sanctuary that had been the crew's greatest comfort was now transformed into a claustrophobic, steel coffin awaiting a deadly, inescapable hydrostatic shock. The knowledge that the American forces were now operating with lethal accuracy at all depths fundamentally broke the psychological barrier of safety. Commanders began to hesitate, taking fewer risks and aborting missions at the slightest sign of an approaching U.S. surface vessel. The constant, low-level dread of the next decisive depth charge run began to erode the fighting spirit and operational efficiency of the crews. Sailors became hypersensitive to every ping of the American sonar, knowing that contact was often a prelude to a fatal attack. Maintaining morale and aggressive patrolling became an almost impossible task for the submarine command structure. The enemy's weapon had been transformed, and so too had the mental landscape of the underwater war for the Japanese. The deep dive, once an evasion, was now a potential descent toward a crushing finality from which there was no return. The once proud admirals could only watch as their elite submarine force was methodically reduced by a weapon they had carelessly dismissed. This loss of confidence had far-reaching strategic effects, severely limiting the ability of the Japanese to gather intelligence or interdict Allied supply lines. The inability to safely transport crucial resources or launch long-range patrols effectively strangled the distant Japanese island garrisons. The change in fortunes demonstrated a profound lesson that complacency, especially concerning an enemy's technical capacity, can be a fatal flaw in modern warfare. The Japanese sailors knew their advantage was gone, and this psychological defeat was as crippling as any physical damage to their hulls. The corrected depth charge settings and the subsequent improved ASW tactics were instrumental in securing a decisive victory for the Allies in the Pacific. The immediate neutralization of the Japanese submarine threat allowed Allied supply convoys and troop transports to move with greater impunity. This dramatically improved the logistical flow of men and material necessary to support the island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. The ability to successfully interdict Japanese supply lines, which had previously been protected by deep-diving submarines, rapidly accelerated the enemy's resource starvation. Merchant shipping losses for the Japanese soared to unsustainable levels, crippling their ability to wage a prolonged war. The successful sinking of numerous Japanese naval submarines also cleared the way for Allied fleet movements and major naval engagements. The pressure applied by the U.S. submarine fleet, now unhampered by flawed torpedoes and supported by an effective anti-submarine escort, became overwhelming. The cumulative effect of this technical correction was a critical turning point in the Battle of the Pacific's logistical and operational dimensions. This small, technical fix contributed as much to the victory as any large-scale battle fought by surface fleets. The American ability to adapt, learn from failure, and implement rapid, intelligence-driven changes proved to be a decisive advantage. The destruction of the Japanese submarine arm meant the Imperial Navy could no longer effectively screen its main battle groups or gather crucial intelligence far from shore. The war's conclusion was hastened by the crippling loss of naval tonnage and the sheer psychological burden placed upon the Japanese command. The depth charge, once a symbol of failure, became an emblem of American technical ingenuity and relentless pursuit of tactical superiority. The eventual victory was the sum of many parts, and the silent, crushing effectiveness of the newly set depth charges was undoubtedly one of the most vital. The history of the depth charge correction remains a powerful and often overlooked case study in the critical role of intelligence and ordnance reliability in modern warfare. The story serves as a stark reminder that even the most seemingly minor technical flaws can have catastrophic strategic consequences if left unaddressed. The transition from a mocking enemy to a terrified victim underscores the rapidity with which technological advantages can be gained and lost in a global conflict. The countless sailors who served on U.S. destroyers, frustrated by their early failures, were ultimately vindicated by the eventual, devastating effectiveness of their weapon. The initial complacency of the Japanese admirals stands as a textbook example of the danger of underestimating an adversary's capacity for correction and innovation. Today, the debris of the sunken Japanese submarines, resting at depths where the corrected depth charges finally found them, are silent memorials to this pivotal shift. The lessons learned from the Mark VII and its flawed settings permanently informed U.S. Navy ordnance doctrine, leading to a relentless pursuit of perfection in all weapon systems. Modern anti-submarine warfare is a direct inheritor of the rigorous, intelligence-driven tactics developed in the wake of this early war failure. The Mark IX depth charge, with its deeper settings, became the standard, reliable weapon that contributed mightily to the security of the Allied shipping lanes. The story is a powerful narrative of technical evolution overcoming operational setback, showcasing American industrial and intellectual might. It demonstrates that the victories of a nation are often secured not only on the battlefield but also in the quiet, focused labs of its scientists and engineers. The silent, deep-sea legacy of the crushed Japanese submarines is a testament to the fact that in war, a few hundred feet of calibration can mean the difference between life and death.